So I have a couple of announcements for you all in my little analog notebook here. One, I've talked to several of you about your accommodation plans from McBurney, and it's wonderful to have those chats. If I have not had that chat with you, and maybe you're aware that I've gotten a letter, it would be great to chat with you. So it's sort of up to you to make an appointment with me. So come on, bring it on. I'd love to say hi and introduce myself. So that was one thing. Second thing, you may notice that if you're one of those people that obsessively checks your email like every 5 minutes, you got an email yesterday from me. If you have not checked your email yet and you're thinking about maybe just dumping it all into your junk folder, oh no, wait, don't do that. This is an important email. You need it. So definitely do not delete this email. If you need the email again, or you sort of just had sleepy fingers and you were like, crap, it's in the trash, just email me and I'll send you another copy. This email contains the sort of links to detailed instructions where you can find out how to leverage your free Adobe Creative Cloud subscription for the class. So by the way, I do want to point out with regards to Adobe Creative Cloud, we are using a few Creative Cloud apps. We're going to definitely get into Photoshop, and we're definitely going to get into Adobe Premiere, probably most heavily. There are a couple of others that we may use in kind of a light way. You have access to the entire Adobe Creative Cloud, as far as I know, through this license agreement. So if you're thinking about learning maybe another Adobe program and you're sitting in your room and you have time to kill, there's nothing preventing you from using the campus's free LinkedIn Learning service to look at some videos and try out maybe something that we don't cover in this class. So I know After Effects is another really super popular option for people. I would also recommend, for sure, and I don't think we're going to get a chance to really cover it in this class, I would also recommend Adobe Audition if you're interested in any kind of music or audio authoring. Those are some really good options. And then, of course, Adobe InDesign, which we also do not teach in this class, is a really powerful desktop publishing application where you do graphics and stuff like that. And I know that if you're looking towards the graphic design certificate in the art department, that Adobe InDesign is going to be the primary tool used kind of throughout the graphic design curriculum. So there you go. So if anybody has any questions about this, they're probably like the type of questions that need significant technical support. Seems like every year when I do this, we always have 3 or 4 students that have some very strange computer configurations, and for whatever reason they can't, do the Adobe install. If you find yourself having trouble, you can go ahead and email me. I'm going to warn you in advance. I'm going to refer you to the Adobe product specialist at DoIt, who knows like Adobe backwards and forwards and can hopefully help you get that straightened out. But if you need to kind of engage in that type of help, just let me know. I'll do my best to get you taken care of. And just so you know, like obviously 100% committed to your success. We have had every once in a while in this class, we have a really intractable technical problem, and I will stay with you to the end, even if it means maybe getting a new computer or whatever you have to do. It can sometimes, that happens extremely rarely, but it does happen. So today, as promised, I guess first of all, before I maybe get into lecture content, does anybody have any questions about anything related to anything? Awesome. I'm trying to think if I got any email questions that would be good to share with you all, but I think they were pretty straightforward. Okay, so today, as promised, we're going to be talking about this sort of maybe just refreshing you on the tail end of last week's lecture, because I know I got a little crunched for time towards the end. But really sort of the salient point of this last, kind of grouping of slides is that where we start to come into the sort of flow of what I would consider modern and contemporary technology development, kind of things that resemble the technology that we use today, we're really thinking about the sort of logical dividing line there as the sort of post-war era. And for a lot of reasons, there are a lot of cultural, and specifically really just talking about the United States in this particular context. But I also think that you can see a lot of the same technological developments that we're talking about happening internationally. So if you look at, highly industrialized countries like Japan or at that time, it was Korea. This was even before the Korean War. So those types of economies are also growing in the same way that this country is. So when we look at the computer as weapon, of course we see a different type of labor force starting to come into computing, where at this point, it's really kind of one of the first moments in which computing was really used as a tool that could be replicated and kind of magnified at scale. It wasn't just some guy in his lab with his thing, basically messing around with this tiny little computer machine. It was sort of implemented at scale. And this is sort of the age of computers that are bigger than your house. And there's some very, concrete reasons why computers were so large. It was that they were actually more interested in figuring out the technology. They weren't interested in making it portable. They weren't interested in making it a consumer commodity even. So if you had an airplane hangar to build a computer in, that is actually the most convenient way to do it, because it's a lot faster to sort of bodge things together when you don't have to worry about fitting them in your pocket, right? I mean, that's the real design challenge of a tool like this, is its scale. So yeah, you have just the age of giant computers. And if I jump into sort of today's slides, today we're really going to be talking about computer art and early computer art, kind of how artists first started using computers. Because I just spent, I don't know, a couple minutes at least telling you that computers were used as instruments of warfare. So how do you go from an instrument of warfare to an instrument of art making and an instrument of communicating cultural values or communicating shared stories? That's a huge leap, right? So we're going to talk about that mostly today. And we're also going to talk about the other sort of aspect of computer art and its development, which is this search for legitimacy. I think that we all sort of spent a little bit of time in the last lecture looking at some painting and looking at sculpture, and really that was what the art world was made of in the last several hundred years. So pretty much everything that has come because of the innovation of photography and of these computer-assisted technologies is all sort of in the last 100 years. So we're really sort of looking at these media that are even, considered mainstream media today, but in the sort of like rarefied academic museum art world. Oh, you might see a flared nostril or two, and this sort of like, oh dear, we don't do that. And so it's this sort of stuffiness, I guess, or a sort of tradition bending sort of attitude towards organizing culture. And that's something we definitely see in the fine arts still. So when we talk about computer art and kind of where it came from, we went from these really sort of ooky research machines, and we're going to talk about the transition of giant room-sized research machines to something like a personal computer. And that transformation happens in less than 25 years, which is actually kind of incredible, right? You could take a computer literally the size of this room, where you would have to walk through it and plug and unplug, cables, and within a couple of decades, you would find yourself with a computer that you can access with a keyboard. You can work with it graphically. You can access it with a pointing device, aka a mouse. So all of these things are sort of like intentional developments. When computer art was in its infancy, you really had two major centers of computer research. And it's no mystery or no mistake that those two areas became sort of the nexus of computer art. Because, and I'm not joking here, that's where the computers were. That's how few computers there were in the world at this time. So places like on the east coast of the United States, you have the East Coast sort of MIT area, multiple universities in that area that are involved with computing research and being actually actively subsidized by the Department of Defense and DARPA, the Department of Advanced Research Projects Agency, some other government agencies that in that post-war era, they said to themselves, well, being the world leader in these types of tools is obviously going to be essential for us to what? To protect ourselves? Maybe, but no, actually, I think that in the 50s and 60s, there was a very sort of aggressive kind of drive to basically spread democracy all over the earth. And that was, part of the sort of conversation. Obviously not part of any informed conversation now, but, there's a reason why they call it the Cold War, and it's because the US was planning for global domination, and so was, at that time, it was the USSR. So there was this notion that, this arms race, which it was basically an arms race, that this arms race was somehow in the country's best interest. And of course, when artists started getting in there and started thinking about it, artists and academics and all sorts of people within the sort of time frame of the 70s and 80s started to kind of come back in and question that and really question imperialism. And this is also the period of decolonization, right? So we talked a little bit about colonialism and and how awful it is, but this sort of period in which computers are becoming more interested in or more intertwined in our world. It's also the same period that a lot of governments are actively being decolonized. So the other area that I want to mention in terms of technological innovation, there would be two places, and that would be Berlin and Tokyo. And so it's true that after World War II, Tokyo and the Japanese country in general was really suffering and building back their abilities. They were also hobbled by certain military treaties. So what happened there basically is that what used to be a kind of weapons producing machine or sort of producing things for war transitioned into a let's create consumer goods and let's create industrial goods. And so their economy shifted fundamentally, and I think it would be really insane to talk about tech-based art and not talk about Eastern Asian centers like Tokyo, like Hong Kong, like Seoul. If people are also maybe wondering, during this period that we're talking about from 1960 to 1975, the so-called capital of the art world was actually New York, New York. Where is the capital of the art world now? At this current moment today? The capital of the art world, you'd probably have to get in a little bit of a disagreement with somebody about it being Dubai, Shanghai, or London, I would say. Those would be my three kind of candidates. And so, these are just shifts in global economies, shifts in global culture, shifts in governments and their practices that enable new forms of expression for people that live in countries. So obviously it's all really complex. But I think during this period of time, I think that computer art was so rarefied and so practiced by so few, we really can point to just 3 or 4 countries and say, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much what was going on. So we had a lot of artists sort of leading up to this who were thinking about making work with machines, but they weren't yet kind of taking that full step of making work with actual computers. So this is actually a machine that looks like it is a computer, or has created work from computer logic, but it's actually just the physics of a pen moving around. This is one of the very widely credited as being like the very first computer graphic. And as you can see, it's pretty minimalist. That's a very kind way of saying that there's not much to it. If anybody ever says that your work is minimalist, it could be a compliment, but it might not be. So it's kind of like if somebody says your work is amazing. I usually take it as a compliment. That's the best way to do it, because then you're just like, yeah, thanks, obviously. But yeah, it's a subtle art. So yeah, we have this this is the very first computer-based image. And I actually have in my garage a piece of equipment that is the type of equipment that makes this. And it's a cylinder where the paper rolls around on a cylinder. And then there's a pen that just moves back and forth. And as the paper rolls, the pen moves up and down on the paper because the paper's advancing. And it's totally fascinating to watch it operate. I just love it. Oh, by the way, I guess I have a bunch of old computer toys at my house, obviously. But yeah, this one in particular is really beautiful, and just the way it moves is really enchanting. But yeah, it's basically a technology called a plotter. And one of the things that actually kind of excites me about early computer art is that there are tons and tons of contemporary artists that use plotters today for cutting things and for making illustrations. So it's actually still a technology that's very much in use today. It's just this is a super old iteration of it. You also see, and this is from the same artist. This is a German artist who used to work in Berlin. I have, for some reason that I don't fully understand, I have tons of German artists in this show, in this slideshow. But this one in particular was really interested in the idea of paying an homage to an actual work of art. So what is this kind of riffing off of? There's a painter named Paul Klee. Here, I'll show you. And at this time, a big part of the conversation around digital art was basically, I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not art. People were, if you read some of the original reviews of some of the first digital artists, they're super hostile. And they basically are sort of this person didn't even do anything. They just turned the dial on a machine. That's ridiculous. And so you get this sort of talk, and artists really felt like it was important. I mean, you can see the formal similarity here, just in terms of the shapes. So artists felt like it was really important to link their work to successful works of art, and that they thought that that was a great way to sort of start a conversation about how what they were doing actually could be art. And I mean, I think when we compare something like this against contemporary digital artwork, what's the big difference? Contemporary digital artwork probably would be maybe a lot, I don't know, more developed maybe, or more complex. It'll have, just say for starters, maybe it has a full color palette, or maybe it has, yeah. Yeah, sure. You can definitely see more of the kind of human touch. Dare I say that? Yeah, we can say that. That's okay. And yeah, I mean, that's basically what we have been able to do is that computers are fundamentally like mimetic. In other words, they're programmed devices. They only do what we tell them to do, right? So their fundamental limitation is us. So if we tell a computer, to make a bunch of lines and make a bunch of circles, then that's what we're going to get. And if we sort of keep pushing that further, as humans, we're going to get better computer art. And so the reason we have better computer art today is for the simple reason that we've been doing it longer. Like, we have better expectations of the computer. We have more complicated expectations of the computer. And we also understand more about how we interact with computers, which is a really fundamental part of that puzzle. So the story of early computer art is kind of a little bit like kind of ugh, because it's super boring. And it doesn't start to get exciting probably into the 70s. It starts to get interesting, and people start to do things that really go beyond this like sort of clumsy looking, plotted drawing. That's like 90% of early computer art is clumsy plotter drawing. And so you'll see in this next set of slides that it starts getting a little slicker and a little more sophisticated, and graphics systems start developing. So I did want to include one sort of like preview of if you were a computer scientist or you were an artist working with a computer scientist, which is the only way you would ever get to make computer art in the 70s, you would have this is your computer. And your computer is basically all these giant tape deck units that are like the size of industrial refrigerators. And then this desk has your monitor and your keyboard. And so that's how you interface with the room around you. It's pretty trippy. And fundamentally, to be honest, like, our computer systems have not changed that much. Like, you can all look at this and say, yeah, that looks like a monitor or some sort of screen and some sort of thing where you sit down and put information into it, right? So that format actually is pretty much the same format that you would have if you're working on a web server today. Your web server is probably about that big. That's the only difference. But it's probably like in California in some rack room, and you're just kind of interfacing with it remotely. So it is kind of amazing, I think. People, love to wax poetically about, oh, how much things have changed. And I'm sort of like, I'm not so sure. I'm pretty sure I'm still talking to a rectangle, right? And so in a lot of ways, the format has not changed really at all. It's what's inside has changed. So getting into kind of some more sophisticated computer work where there is definitely something, and oh my God, this might be on the final exam. There's a tendency in early computer art, there's like a compositional device that dominates many compositions in early computer art. And that compositional device is called the grid. So if anyone here has ever done computer programming of graphics, one of the reasons why the grid is so ubiquitous in early computer art is because it's one of the things you can do with code, is to make a row and then a series of columns, right? So it's probably one of the, if I teach my code class, it's actually maybe like week 3 of coding is how to make a grid. And so it's also an interesting kind of platform for what a lot of early computer artists were sort of looking to explore, and that is that they're trying to usually set up a system with a very narrow set of parameters. Like, let's say here we have a box nested inside of a box. It looks like there might be some slight rotation. There might be some slight variation in the stroke. but they're basically a series of repeated components that are combined in different ways. And so that type of investigation or that type of question and answer process where you ask yourself, how can things be similar and yet different, or how can I explore variation? That's just really well accomplished in a grid. I mean, it's just kind of natural to line stuff up. So yeah, so this is Vera Molnar. She's actually, she's a super fascinating person. She is in her 90s, and she is still making computer art in Paris. And there's a really cool YouTube documentary about her where she kind of goes through all of her prints and stuff. And so she really was like pretty much like the sole female computer artist for the entire first phase of computer art history. And you know, you may be asking yourself, gee, that's odd. Well, it's not that odd when you consider that, like, in the 1960s, some women still had trouble getting into career occupations because of work rights laws. And, you know, this is all over the world, right? So I think as you see the sort of profile of women raise in society in general, then you see it go up in this field. And that sort of makes sense, I guess. The other sort of thing that you can do with a grid, which is kind of really super fun, is back in the early days of computing, there was actually really no such thing as a pixel. The first pixel-based file format was developed in the 1970s. So what did they use before then? They used ASCII characters. And if some of you are really interested in coding or whatever, there are a bunch of ASCII text generators where you can kind of make labels for yourself. So like I have one that's like a sleeping cat, and then it has my name in it in ASCII characters. And that's what I put at the bottom. If I make a big piece of code, like an app or something, that'll be like my, look me up. Yeah, they're just super fun. And it's a very like extremely old school way of dealing with image brightness, right? So in this case, the brightness channel of the pixels is getting mapped to these text characters. And you can see that sort of, you know, continues in lots of situations. So at some point, when somebody made, like, I don't know, the 1,000th or 5,000th ASCII art thing, somebody said, dude, we should make a file format where each of those letters is like a box that's different colors. Right? They'll be like, what should we call it? I don't know, dude, let's call it a pixel. And that's basically how pixel images came to be. They're an offshoot of this strange practice. Yeah?
So if before pixels were using ASCII characters, how were the ASCII characters actually being popped up on the screen?
That's a really good question. They were just popped up as ASCII characters. So you're talking about hardware pixels?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, those are sort of different, and they're like that. It's done in a different way. So like if it's a hardware pixel, it basically just gets converted from a bitmap, but those bitmaps were so minuscule because they were so, you know, super small. Like a bitmap of an ASCII character is like 8 bits basically, and it's 8-bit. That's the name for that type of a character. But then before, and this is going to make your head hurt, before they had monitors and screens, they actually used to do everything by paper plot. So they would actually execute it through the printer. So the printer was the screen, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, it's hard to even like think about that stuff now because it's almost like so primitive that it's like, I can't, like my laser printer, you know, is 5,000 pixels in one direction. And yeah, so anyway, basically, yeah, images, the other reason why there wasn't a lot of bitmap images early on is because, relatively speaking, they take up a ton of space. So when you compare something like, let's say this drawing with maybe a bitmap image that's the same size, this drawing is actually going to be much, much more efficient because it only contains maybe a couple of points, right? Like maybe 100 points. So it's like 100 lines of code versus a bitmap image, which is like, you know, a complex for every single pixel. So yeah, as we move into like the 1980s, that's when sort of bitmapping and bitmap display really took over. And the sole reason is, you know, you get into this huge transition moment, which everybody loves to talk about as like the most important thing that ever happened in computing. I don't know about that. I think, yeah, sure, it's important, and it was, you know, really like an important moment. But there were lots of people who were doing the same sort of research. They just didn't sell it in a way that people wanted to buy. So there were products out there that were basically doing what the Apple II and the Macintosh did. They did it for like $10,000 more per person. So it just didn't become, you know, economically successful. So when people say, oh, the Apple invented the personal computer, I think that is blatantly false. That's actually not true. It was Xerox, a company named Xerox, invented the first personal computer. What I will give Apple credit for is they popularized the first personal computer. And there's a big difference there between invented and popularized. So basically around this time is around the time when screen display starts to become like a thing that people want and a thing that actually works. Because it's not demanding like 100% of the system's resources just to get fonts on the screen. But it's also sort of the moment in which these computers actually started getting into people's homes. And I think we all understand maybe intuitively a little bit of something about the art process, but you tell me, would you rather make art in an environment like this? Or would you rather make an art in your room, like where you're kind of chilling, you got your seltzer, you know, you're good? Definitely at home. So really the personal computer revolution is incredibly interlinked with the revolution of graphics and art making in work. One thing that I think you're going to really start noticing is that instead of having sort of basically like very few people making very rarefied art, what you're going to see after this time is this gigantic explosion of people making work with computers. And it's in two realms. It starts to become kind of the lingua de franca of the blockbuster film industry very quickly. And so it starts to have a very commercially relevant kind of outgrowth to it. So when you look at, you know, blockbuster films from the 1980s, they're loaded with bad computer graphics. Like that's just part of the thing. You also have people who are able to enter even the sort of highfalutin computer art field by doing things on a home computer and basically coming up with the justification to use a larger computer. And so the ideas start kind of getting out there where people are like, oh, maybe I could try this and maybe I could try that. And at this time, though, critically, what's sort of holding things back in terms of like a true sort of blossoming of the computer art field, there are two things that are holding the field back. One is hardware. It's still pretty slow. Okay, this is like getting into my lifetime here. So when I was, yeah, like, okay, 1990, I would have been using something like a Pentium 1, maybe. And making something this size, like a Photoshop image this size, would be a little challenging. So it's still not totally there. Definitely at some point in the last couple years, I feel like computer hardware has kind of punched through some sort of singularity where I got this new workstation for myself, and it is so fast, I literally cannot invent things for it to fail at. Like, I've been trying. I'm like, oh, please render 1,000 cats jumping up and down. Done. I'm like, whoa. Like, it is sick fast. And it's not even that, not like I paid a ton of money for it. It's just a normal computer. So in the 80s, things were definitely like, look, Mom, I made a digital image. And it's this big. Isn't it cute? Getting into the 90s, you start to sort of see artists really deal with this stuff at scale. One thing that's important to understand about these images is that these images are actually like actual size. These are not representations of larger images. That's how precious pixels were back then. You also, in the 1980s, you also had this really interesting sort of revival of the sort of like 60s post-war kind of futurism. And so that's probably best exemplified by the original show, Star Trek, right? We're gonna have this sort of utopian group of people hanging around the galaxy, doing cool stuff. So the 80s definitely had its own sort of version of that via Star Trek: The Next Generation. You also had shows that were really actively interested in where technology was taking us. So Max Headroom is this crazy, crazy show that was on this thing called a television. They had a channel called HBO, and it was basically it was like a show on HBO back in the 80s. And it was this guy who pretended to be a computer animated character, but he was a real dude. It was super weird. It was a really famous show, but I think people love to talk about the show now because it sort of illustrates how crazy people in the 80s were for anything futuristic. And so they thought, wow, it's a television show host that's a robot, but he's like actually a real guy. It was super weird. So I've got a couple more slides. I think, during the 90s, the big sort of development in the 90s, of course, we get faster computers. We also get probably the major development of the 1990s, and historically, is certainly the development of the World Wide Web. So that whole period that I was just describing of the 80s, where people were kind of hanging out on their personal computers, they could sort of talk to people like from other places through your computer. You could do a bulletin board, or sometimes you could have a modem in your computer that would allow you to be part of small local networks. But it is absolutely nothing like what it is today. And what we get with what we call the internet today, most people are really talking about the World Wide Web. And so when Al Gore says, this former Vice President Al Gore is sort of famous for this quote that he invented the internet. I beg to differ. He definitely did not invent the internet. I will say, though, he's not wrong to take some credit for putting in some of the public policy that enabled the World Wide Web. Now, that's very different from the internet, because the internet is like everything. Facebook, Instagram, Discord, like whatever sort of networked, Google, whatever networked services you're on, that's the internet. The World Wide Web is literally only the thing that lets you type your address into a web browser and call up a web page. So it's a small subset of the internet. So in any case, this whole idea of the internet and networks was really kind of part of the optimism of the dot-com era. And I know a little bit of something about that time and took a little bit of a ride on the carousel with jobs and stuff. And it's interesting to note how that kind of came out in the culture when we look at it in retrospect. There's a whole genre of digital art that I call doing stuff on the internet. Literally, like I'm brushing my teeth on the internet. It's an awesome performance. I'm having sex on the internet. It's also an awesome performance. I'm making you pad thai on the internet. Awesome performance. I'm going to have a robot garden over the internet, and you're going to say, wow, that's brilliant. You can water your plants over the internet. You can also shoot animals over the internet. You can even shoot people over the internet. So it did get a little out of hand, a little crazy. But yeah, it was just sort of this really thorough exploration of like, artists were interested in how people treated them over networks. And I think now, if we're thinking about how people treat us over social media, there's a definite thing that happens when people are on remote platforms, right? That they're maybe not as nice as they usually are. And so performance artists were really sort of exploring that a lot in the 90s. And some of it was sort of like, just like my own personal opinion, I can kind of look at some of it and be like, yeah, I guess that was interesting, at the time that it was made. Some of it, I'm sort of like, dude, that's unnecessary. Like, there was a performance artist that got people to log into a virtual gallery and shoot him with a paintball gun for like 3 months solid. And he like lost his mind and had to go to the hospital, like as you could imagine, like if people were shooting at you for that long. And yeah, in general, performance art where people hurt themselves is a little tough. But yeah, interesting way to think about it. The other thing that like really kind of came into flower in the 90s was the idea of digital imaging and digital photography. And just to give you an idea, this image, if you look at the thing, it's like 20 feet, 12 by 20 feet. And it's probably like 2,000 DPI or 2,000 PPI. It's like ridiculously fine. So what is that telling you? That's telling you that computers have come a really long way in terms of like just how can you make a giant digital image, which 20 years before then it would have been a virtual impossibility. There would be no way to make something like this. So that's sort of the story. Aside from all the sort of social changes that are driven by digital media, one of the main sort of markers of progress in digital art is number of things. And why? Because you can measure them. So from year to year, I can have more pixels, I can have more polygons, I can have more materials, or more of everything, basically. And I think when you look at films over the years, you start to just see it just gets more and more complex, right? And so that's sort of like, maybe a little bit cheeky, but that is kind of where we are today, like bigger, better, faster, and sometimes with irony, nostalgia, and thoughtfulness. And so, yeah, we're basically like operating in a place right now where the idea of computer hardware limiting us and limiting our creativity is not really a thing. Even if you have a crappy computer, you can get so much done. Like it's not the number of pixels that makes your image great, right? It's what you put into it, like up here. So I think that that's actually the real challenge for digital artists. There's always been sort of like a wing in the field that is sort of going for bigger and better, more colors, more pixels, more everything. And I think people are, I guess my one observation about the field is that people are becoming really skeptical of that, if not maybe utterly hostile towards that, and just kind of like not wanting to see that, that it's not about making something that's flawless, it's about making something that's you, and making something that actually, expresses what you want to express. So I think that that's kind of like how we can sort of move into this time that we're in today, where, we can say, sure, we can have, something that is technically amazing, or we can have something that's really, really interesting, but we can't always have both. And so that's sort of like that's the peril of the digital artist. But I'm gonna leave you here, I think, and in general, like, we're sort of in the realm of the contemporary now. Woo! Sorry, we've kind of swam through the last like 100 years of weird computer art, and so pretty much from now here on out, like if you see something that's more than 10 years old, like close your eyes, run away. So we're gonna just pretty much be talking about contemporary stuff. And hey, don't forget to send me an email if you need anything, and I'll see you on Tuesday.